Different paints have different textures, different, you know, with oil paint versus acrylic paint versus spray paint versus nail polish.
All right, let's talk about texture and how to make an abstract piece. So, brought this one up last time at the very end of the how to make an abstract piece video when we talked about planning. So we're gonna work on this today. This video should go pretty quick. Well, I guess you would already know that because you know how long the video is before you click on it. Unbelievable. Okay, anyway, just a reminder, we have physical texture and implied texture. Sometimes physical texture is called real texture. I usually use the term physical texture, but anyway. So those are two things. When I'm talking about in the process of creating an abstract piece, we're talking about planning, texture, and painting, or I mentioned like the elements of creating a piece: composition, color, texture. With the elements, I mean the texture is really important. That could be implied texture and physical texture. When I'm talking about going through the stages of like, okay, we went through the planning stage, now we're going to the texture stage, and then we get into the painting. You can apply texture when you paint too, but I'm generally talking about physical texture when we talk about this in stages, because I'm applying the texture first because it needs time to dry, and then I'm going to go and paint over top. And then I create more texture while I paint, but we can talk about that in a minute. So, I've got a couple things here. This is the thing we're going to talk about most. It's just gesso. Gesso is what takes, you know, the canvas. I'm going to give you an example here. Wish I was better prepared for this, but so we'll talk about canvas first, real quick. So I mean, this is just plain old canvas off the roll that was cut. It was not gessoed first. It has this slightly different color. It's kind of like this tan color. It's the same for the back of this canvas, because that's what it would look like when you buy it. I mean, when you buy it without it being primed or gessoed first. Basically, the gesso is just primer. So even this one we're working on, I don't have any blank stuff right now. But I mean, this side has no gesso on it. The front, they primed it first before putting it on the shelves, and you can kind of see here that was the front that they've stapled to the back, and it is white, not this tan color. Same thing even with this thing that I need to finish up painting the edges. In the back is like this tan color. It's like, if you think of like a canvas shoe or a canvas bag, like a lot of like grocery bags, that like reusable bags are often canvas bags, right? Burlap sack type material. My edges here are white because I gessoed them. I primed them. So anyway, if you don't know what gesso is, that's its function, to make it so that you can actually paint on it. So you prime it. If you paint just on a raw canvas, it just the paint seeps in. It's very rough. It's just not really great to paint on unless that's the effect you want. But I mean, it just like takes a lot of your paint, and yeah, really rough. So gesso is the thing that I use not just to prime canvases, like when I stretch my own canvas, but it is the thing that I use to create physical texture. So I would generally, you know, put this on the day before I want to paint, or at least a couple hours. If I have it on really thick, it might take a day or two to actually fully dry before I can paint over it. It just depends on how thick you apply it, I guess. So this is like just through the different gessos over the years that I've bought. I get this at Michael's. It's one of the very few products I ever buy at Michael's, but it is the Liquitex Basics gesso. It's pretty tight. The price is right for it because gesso is kind of expensive sometimes, and it works really, really well. I just like the consistency of it because different gessos have different consistencies and stuff. I never feel the need to sand this down. Also in combination with the canvas that I buy, I just never feel the need to sand it down. So gesso as a like primer or whatever, it's not paint. It functions differently. I would not use it instead of paint. It's very, very thick, and if you get it on your clothes, it's not coming off. So like sometimes paint, if you rush it quick enough, you know, it doesn't stain unless it was maybe really thick or something like that. But this stuff doesn't, it won't come out. And yeah, different consistency altogether. So that's gesso. That is my primary media for creating physical texture on my pieces. So what I mean by physical texture, again, like we use this as an example. It's been painted over, obviously, but there's some stuff where I hope you can see the physical texture a bit, especially here. Ooh, snap. So this stuff, there's a lot of it actually, was put down first, and then I went over it with paint, and it just adds more, to me it just makes the painting just more dynamic and more interesting. There's also, when you're painting it, you are kind of working with and around the texture as well, depending on if you're using brushes or if it's spray paint or another tool to paint with, then like it interacts with those different levels of the different surfaces in a certain way that can make the painting way more interesting, which is one reason why you want to apply texture, is to make your painting more interesting. Or you're adding maybe sculptural elements or something. I'm going to have to put a couple pieces in here that I don't have on hand so you can see what I'm talking about when it comes to some things. So we are talking about abstracts right now. I think that I'm just thinking, am I going to talk about texture in another video? Maybe if I talk about this is how you paint a landscape, because I haven't painted very many landscapes. But I'm going to have, whatever, I'll have this, no, I don't know, never mind. Nope, not going to talk about that. So that's what I use most of the time. Or sometimes I use this impasto acrylic gel. It dries clear. That's the other thing I should say. This stuff is white. It dries white because it's the primer. As you know, like whenever you buy a canvas, it's like primed, and that's the gesso on there. The impasto acrylic gel, it looks white when it's all together there, but it dries clear. When it's really, really thick, it just takes a long time to dry, and I get paranoid whether it's going to be kind of milky or not. So you can add this stuff in while you paint, and it'll just kind of do some different stuff there. I put this on over top sometimes to have like some extra texture. Both of these are pretty different too, so they both dry very hard. Sometimes I use them as adhesives or like almost like a glue. If I want to put like some like collage elements or something on there, then I might want to use this because it'll dry clear. It's kind of like a glue in a way, or you can use it that way. But you can also build it up and have like globs of it, and it will dry, and there'll be like these thick chunks of stuff on there. So sometimes it's kind of cool as like a finish, like almost putting it over your painting when it's done, but like putting like parts in there that are really chunky, and then it hopefully will dry clear, and then it's like this weird element that like, yeah, it's all clear, but I can see there's like this weird like, you know, see-through chunk like on top of it. I don't know. Again, there's a lot of different ways to use texture and why we use texture. Some of it, again, use it, I'm talking about primarily in the process of applying it beforehand, but you can use texture during the piece and after as well. But physical texture, there's a lot of different things you could do, right? So I mean, you could add like things like coffee grounds. I rarely ever use this. I've had this for years, and as you can see, it's still pretty full. Starting to not smell great, but anyway, sometimes you want like a grainy, sandy texture for something. You can apply this. Then you need to figure out how do you have it on the canvas. Well, if you apply a thin layer of the gesso first, then maybe you sprinkle in your bits of coffee grounds or sand or whatever, and then it'll dry, and then it'll still be grainy. I mean, having things be really smooth, I mean, that's a texture too, right? So sometimes even to sand things down, that's something that can help you. Or I mean, what if you wanted to use like some sandpaper and just like glue it into the piece for extra texture, right? You can add all these physical elements. I mean, like having flowers in the piece, that's a different texture than the surface of the canvas. So I mean, there's a lot of different ways we can go with it. Those are just some of the materials that I have here. Also, you can create physical texture with different tools. I usually apply my gesso, and even when I'm painting, you'll see me using palette knives a lot. I've got a bunch of them. But I mean, if you wanted to create, like let's say we put a lot of gesso on, and then we want to like create grooves in the thing so that like yeah, there's grooves in the gesso on the painting. Well, I mean, you could use something like a saw and just drag it along. You could use something like a tin can and kind of roll it across. It's just limitless. You can do so many things, right? So yeah, there's tons of different things you can do. That's kind of, again, just some basic stuff. You can do anything you want. That's what I love about art. You would be grabbing stuff off the street, throw some grass in there, whatever. Then you have these elements of like, well, the grass is going to dry eventually. It's going to die. It's going to change after the piece is done, which is fascinating to think when you use like these living elements or things that maybe fade and shift. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things you could do. Different paints have different textures, different, with oil paint versus acrylic paint versus spray paint versus nail polish. Like texture, physical texture is really, really important. And like I said, especially for an abstract piece, I feel like it just elevates it. It takes it to a whole nother level when you've got these different textures to play with. So one of the pieces that I was going to mention, you could just use paint. You could just use paint in a way to create texture as well. In the middle of painting. So, like I said, I'm gonna show you how I would apply texture to a piece before I start the piece. But as an example, I'll have to insert it here because I sold this piece called Burial. It's a small, I think it was 12 by 12 or 10 by 10 piece. And I'm gonna have a picture of this one. I'm gonna have the whole piece for a second, and then this right in the corner here, there is how I've just thickly applied paint. It's all just straight up paint. It's not paint over gesso. It's super thick and chunky and dried that way eventually, and that's one of my favorite things about that piece, right? You could do that, but when you use paint like that, I mean, paint's not cheap. I would rather get, this gesso, and then if I planned it out ahead of time and I knew I really wanted some thick spots, it's cheaper, and I would prefer to use gesso to do that. But while I'm painting, I do have some spots that are thicker or thinner or whatever. There was something else that I was going to show, and now I forget. But I mean, you could almost draw with gesso or with your texture or whatever, right? Like if you're putting it on in advance, you're picking and choosing where it goes. We talk about how composition is a huge part of creating abstract pieces. Part of that is also like, how are you putting your texture down? Because that's gonna determine how you paint stuff later. We talked many times already about how, everything you do in an abstract piece dictates the next thing you're going to do in the abstract piece. It informs the next thing. This mark means that you have to make another mark over somewhere else, or what have you. So same thing with texture. You apply that first. You kind of want to get a good composition, some balance on there. You want some thick spots to play with, or you want to just do shapes with it or something. Then that's going to dictate how you paint too, because you're going to have to do something with that physical texture you just put on. Some people maybe just paint like it's normal, like it's flat, but I mean, I find it hard to ignore that there's like chunky bits or this little thing. I want to highlight some spots maybe. Like sometimes I would take pieces of this physical texture that's like upraised, and I just kind of highlight it with a different color even. Or something with spray paint especially, it's awesome because you can use like the paint in a way so that it gets, like if you're looking at it from underneath, these bumps have like a certain color, and then on top they have a different color. Anyway, a lot of things you can do. I think that's all I'm going to talk about, like right now with texture. I'm going to show you now what I'm going to do with this piece in creating texture. But I mean, texture is really important. We talked in the planning one, like how sometimes texture, besides just a design element and a way to interact with the piece and make it more interesting, besides that part, because I just really think it makes pieces so much more interesting to have texture of any kind in their physical texture. And you'll no matter what, you're going to have implied texture somehow in there. But I just think it's an element of painting that is super awesome and fun, and also like something to consider and think about, because I think it makes things so much more interesting. It brings the work up to another level when you're conscious and aware of what you're doing with texture. And now I lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? Oh, we sometimes it's using it as a symbol too. You can use texture in a way to guide the viewer into feeling and thinking about your piece in the way that you want them to. So I mean, with that first piece we talked about in the planning video, A Dance with Scarlet, A Self-Loathing Sonnet, the texture there, subtractive texture if you want to call it that, like the cuts into the board, that was very purposeful. It's like, because like again, that like it's it's fitting with the theme. It wasn't just like put on there, like the one we're doing today, I'm just putting on there in a design quality, and it's not necessarily dictating the mood of the piece, or it's like it's not its own character in the piece in the same way that it would be in another painting where I was like cutting into the boards and being very aggressive and stuff like that. There's different ways you can use it, but I mean, it is an element. Just like, I mean, oh, well, how am I using my use of color? Like texture is something you should be thinking about. Color can be used for design only. It can be used for really heavy conceptual pieces too, right? Same thing with texture. So we're gonna get into that right now. So. So, I got this piece here. We talked about thinking it would be the portrait orientation. I like to apply my texture the way that I just like to have it the orientation that I would want it all the time. We did talk a little bit about the fact that this already has some physical texture on it. That's okay, I'm going to work with that. I just wanted to paint over this because I have it already. So, because it's also like gray right now, just to give you an easier time of figuring this out and whatever, I'm going to quickly just put gesso over it, and then when that dries a little, I'll come and put more physical texture on it. So another thing I should mention here is that I like to use these foam brushes. Specific ones that I find in Saskatoon are art placement. I don't like the ones at Michael's or any other place I found them, because they're like the spongy part like just chunks off, and they suck and they disintegrate really quickly. They're pretty cheap, but these ones are good. I wish I knew the brand so I could tell you. But anyway, these foam brushes are really good for just priming and applying smooth coats of anything, but I find them very useful for gesso. However, because they're very delicate, the spongy stuff, and gesso is very thick, then they don't last long. You can see this one has like chunks taken out of it and stuff already. It's a pretty old one. Well, not that old, but I've used it a fair amount of times with gesso, so this is what I would use. So we're going to leave this to dry for a little bit. Then I'm going to come back and put this gesso on, not as a primer, but in a way to create physical texture. I will say, normally I would not do this if I'm painting over something. I would just paint on it. It's already been gessoed. Paint adheres to it just fine, and paint can adhere to the other paint just fine. But I'm just doing this for your benefit, just so it's easier for you to kind of take it in as I'm like putting white on white. Because normally I'd be working on a new canvas and not working on something that's already been done. And so you can kind of see how that'll look. Obviously this isn't perfect. I don't need it to be, but just enough, hopefully, to make sense for you. You can kind of still see in this area the physical texture showing through, that the gesso that was already applied is kind of showing there, because I'm not going to apply my gesso so thick that it kind of goes over that, but that's still there. So we'll let that dry, and then we'll come back to apply our own gesso as texture. Okay, so this is dry enough. I'm feeling impatient today because I wanted to do this today. So we're going to add, some gesso, some physical texture on here right meow. And go from there. Alright. So I mentioned before, I usually have it the orientation that it's going to stay. Like when I gesso it, when I put on this physical texture, I usually put it in that orientation that I'm going to paint it later. So again, sometimes it's more of like a, how do I want this thing to feel, very deliberately, you know, aggressive and rough, whatever with the texture. Sometimes, like this time, it's going to be more of like, well, I just want to put something on there. It'll kind of give me some reference points to actually draw from when I'm painting. So I just kind of like dump my gesso in a spot usually and then move it around from there. Some of this other gesso is going to come off because it, like I mentioned, it's not 100% dry. I'm just like, it's the temperature in here today, or the humidity or whatever in this room today also means that everything's taking longer to dry. Sometimes I can't believe how quickly things dry in this room, and other times it's like, why is this so slow? So I just kind of do that to get stuff on there, and then palette knife is usually what I use to kind of do that. So remember, this is Dumb Hope. This piece will be Dumb Hope, but with putting on the gesso right now, it is beginning to take shape, even though I haven't started painting. I am, again, when I apply paint, it's going to be, you know, I have to think about where the stuff is. I will mention, because we're talking about gesso right now, we're applying texture in general, but like I said, gesso is the thing I use maybe 90% of the time that I'm applying physical texture in advance to the piece. It will shrink a bit as it dries. So as it dries, like you can see, this is like a certain thickness here. It will shrink a little bit, so keep that in mind. It's not going to stay exactly the same. So there's, again, for me, I'm just trying to like create a certain composition with this that I can play with later, is what I'm trying to do. And then kind of, you know, think about how things are going to be balanced. I think the more I paint, like the more I love using physical texture, and like really thick. Like it's just something that I haven't got it over it. It's not just like a neat trick that I use and then I move on and from it. Like it's, sometimes I find something like this and I put it into my, if you want to call it my toolkit, of things that I'm like, yeah, I'm just gonna do this forever. Like I'm gonna use texture in this way for so long. Use gesso in this way to create physical texture for a long time to come, because it's so useful. And it's part of my painting style. Part of my painting style is the fact that I have physical texture on here before I even begin painting. I guess is really what it comes down to. And like I said, I like, over the course of time, it's gotten thicker and thicker, it seems, because I'm just enjoying that sculptural element, I guess if you want to call it that, to these pieces. And again, some of this will shrink so much, like, that it'll be almost smooth, like you won't be able to really notice it. The other thing is that I don't do it often, but from time to time I'll smooth out some spots before I begin painting. You know, especially like this stuff here, because like the brush I was using was an older one, and the edge wasn't completely straight, because there were like chunks kind of taken out of it, and then it left all these little grooves here. And usually I use a foam brush instead of a bristled brush to apply gesso, specifically so that I don't get this type of scenario going on here. Now with this painting, it probably won't matter that much, but I might kind of sand some of that stuff down. And I think that's all I'm going to do with this one right now. Like, I mean, it kind of is that quick sometimes. Like, I feel like I've got this composition here that I really like. When we talked about composition and balance and stuff earlier, again, it's something you just kind of have to learn what you like over time, or what works and what doesn't work. So I've got a lot in this section here, and that's why I kind of have some here and some here. I feel like that balances out. I've got some on the top here as well. I don't need anything over there. That would make this weighted way too heavy. is how it would kind of look like and feel like to a viewer such as myself. You know, like there's this open space here. We've got a lot of open space here as well. But again, we've got kind of some here and some up here and this down here. So it's balanced in this way that I'm happy with. You know, some spots are thick, some are thinner. And depending on how I apply my paint, you'll be able to kind of see these little gaps in here as well. But we'll see. Anyway, that was just applying the texture there and talking a little bit about texture. Yeah, that's kind of it for that. Next, I want to actually start painting this piece, and we'll see what happens. It'll just be like a regular art process piece. Except I will. That's the thing. Sometimes I actually listen to the music. If I already know what I'm going to do, I listen to music while I'm applying the texture too. Sometimes. I didn't this time, but the tricky thing is going to be when I'm painting this piece, I'm going to have music on, and if I want to talk over it, I mean, if I'm going to have to turn it down first or whatever, and as you know, like, you never really get to listen to what I'm listening to because of copyright for YouTube, so I always have to put some other track down over top of these art process videos, and usually I'm not talking in them, so it's not really a problem with editing. But for this one, either I'm not going to talk at all. Well, I have to do some talking too. Well, I don't know if I do. I'll probably do a little bit of setup. We'll see what happens. Anyway, that'll be the next one. Is going to be painting this piece, Dumb Hope, and we'll see what happens with that. And that'll kind of end this little mini series of how to make an abstract painting. Again, if you have any questions or any requests of how to do something or what I should do next or something like that, please just leave that in the comments. That would be awesome. I'd love to go in there, you know, and find some stuff if you're interested. So that's all I got for today. We'll see you on another time for some more art process and instructional video time.